for moderates, those of us that are called rhinos, we do feel you're on the outside because moderate Republicans get challenged in primaries, not because they've done a bad job, but because they're not ideologically pure enough.
Former New Jersey Governor Todd Whitman, today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. There was a time in American politics, not that long ago really, when there was such a thing as liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. But the landscape has changed, and the two parties have become much more polarized, especially, it seems, the MAGA-dominated Republican Party. Now, 20 years ago, a prominent Republican warned us about the divide and what it was going to do to the country. Todd Whitman, two-term governor of New Jersey, a Rockefeller Republican, and former EPA administrator under the Bush administration, told us that the GOP had turned away from the Republican Party that she knew when she was growing up. In 2005, Whitman wrote a book called It's My Party Too, The Battle for the Heart of the GOP. Now, she and I talked about that book in February of 2005, just a couple of weeks after the start of George W. Bush's second administration. And as you listen to this interview, it's important to keep that timeline in mind. Some of the references you'll hear sound a little dated, but the things she's talking about are very relevant today. In just a moment, our conversation.
Is time travel possible? Well, probably not. But it is possible to listen to a conversation from the 30-year archive of noted radio personality Bill Thompson. Enjoy!
So here now, from 2005, Todd Whitman.
Actually, the It's My Party Too came from a magazine piece the New York Times did back when I was governor, and I liked it so much that I kept that cover sheet and kept thinking of the title all the way through.
I almost get the feeling that you are increasingly feeling as though you're on the outside looking in.
Well, for moderates, those of us that are called rhinos, Republicans in name only by the people I have identified as social fundamentalists, you do feel you're on the outside because you've seen what's happened to other Republicans, moderate Republicans. They'll get challenged in primaries, as Arlen Specter was in this last election cycle, and challenged not because they've done a bad job and not because their constituents don't like them, but because they're not ideologically pure enough for these social fundamentalists. And when they attacked Arlen Specter, they said, we're not just going after Senator Specter, we want to send a message to the other moderate Republicans in the Senate that if they don't get in line quickly, they're going to be next. And that's just not the party in which I grew up.
There aren't even any real liberal Republicans left, are there?
You don't dare use the L word. I mean, the worst thing they can say about you is Rockefeller Republican, although Bob Novak had an editorial not too long ago, an op-ed, where he said the title was, Is Bush Moving to the Middle? As if that was becoming moderate, I guess it was, and as if that was the worst thing that could possibly happen.
At one point in your book when you're saying that Barry Goldwater, by today's standards,
would be a moderate. Barry Goldwater would. He was pro-choice, and he was not against things like gays in the military. And that just doesn't pass the litmus test with the people who are applying it today. I mean, in today's Republican Party, as far as those who are getting the press and who actually control the levers of power, not the majority of the party, I still don't believe it. They're controlling the perception and the visualization of our party. If you are pro-choice, you can't be good Republican. If you believe we should even begin a discussion on embryonic stem cell, you're not a good Republican. If you think government has a role in protecting the environment, you're not a good Republican. If you don't believe in amending the Constitution for only the second time ever to restrict individual freedoms, you're not a good Republican. And it doesn't matter to them if you have a great record on tax cutting, if you've been tough on crime, if you have been fiscally conservative, if you have believe in a strong foreign policy and engaged foreign policy and a strong national defense. That's not good enough if you're not right on these other issues.
What I find so confusing, so perplexing, though, is the Republican leadership is not stupid. They've seen what has happened to the Democratic Party, as you talk about in the late 60s, when it became so liberal that Americans turned to the Republican Party for 5 out of the next 6 presidential elections. Can't the Republican leadership see what it is doing?
Well, the people who are driving this particular brand of republicanism are on a mission. It's a bigger mission somehow. They'd rather have someone who votes against them 100% of the time in terms of a Democrat than a Republican who only votes with them 85 or 89% of the time. And that's why, I mean, you have to give credit where credit's due. They have been single-minded about focusing on local party organizations and building from the grassroots up these social fundamentalists. And the moderates have been kind of sitting back and saying, look, this isn't possible. Common sense will take control. People who think SpongeBob SquarePants is a bigger threat to the future of our country than the tax measures, can't possibly be the ones who are going to determine what happens. And yet they have gotten control because we've been sitting back. And I mean, I would love by 2008 to have a Rudy Giuliani or a Tom Ridge or a John McCain actually considered for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party. Today they couldn't because of their position on certain social issues, and that makes no sense at all.
But as you point out in the book, those are three among our most popular Republican politicians.
Exactly. But again, it's mind-boggling to me. I don't understand it, and that's why I say that's why I identify them as social fundamentalists, to show the distinction between them and true conservatives. I mean, these people are not the true conservatives, and probably there's not much point in trying to reach accommodation with the social fundamentalists because they just won't bend on anything, and anybody who does compromise is seen as spineless or, doesn't have deep enough beliefs. But the point is to reach out to the conservatives. I mean, I know a lot of very conservative, pro-life people who don't believe you should amend the Constitution to ban gay marriage. They think it is something that more appropriately belongs with the states. And yet, for the social fundamentalists, that's not good enough. And to them, you can't be a good Republican if you are pro-life but believe in the case of rape or incest, there's reason for discussion. And that is so narrow-minded that it doesn't represent the majority of the party, and you've got to reach out to those other people and say, look, it's time for you to be heard, and it's not going to happen if you don't get up and do it.
Well, now, you've been in politics virtually all your life. Is this the first time that there has been no room for discussion?
It's the first time I've seen it this narrow. 64 got pretty bitter, and that was really the first time you saw this kind of nastiness start to unfold. Not so much with Barry Goldwater himself, but the people around him. There were a lot of the grassroots organizers who were extremely rabid about it. I mean, they felt strongly, and I can remember being out at that convention. If you didn't have a Goldwater button on, you didn't even want to cross the street. I mean, there were fistfights that broke out. When Nelson Rockefeller was asked to speak at that convention, and I talk about it in the book, I can remember one of the New Jersey delegates standing up in a chair and actually spitting at the man. I mean, he was the governor of New York State. He had been a candidate for president. And he was very good about it, though. They booed him so badly that he couldn't be heard. So he just stood there and he said, I've been given 5 minutes to speak, and I'm not moving till I've had my 5 minutes. And eventually they calmed down. But that was the first time you saw that. Then it kind of went away. And now what we've seen is that there's been a change in the sort of the perspective of the parties on how you win elections. And instead of trying to broaden the existing base that they have by appealing to moderates, because it used to be you ran primaries to your left or right, depending whether you're Republican or Democrat, and came back to the middle for the general elections to appeal to the big majority of moderates in the country. And still better than 40% of the people identify themselves as moderates when you ask them. And now it's not that, it's what you need to do is focus on your base. Harden that base. Don't let that go anywhere. And then that's how you get them out to Election Day, to the polls. And after, I think probably the day after the Supreme Court said George W. Bush was president, Karl Rove started to focus on the 4 million evangelicals who had not voted in 2000. Now, he did exactly what he should do as the partisan person in the White House, as the person responsible for getting the president majorities in both houses and getting him reelected. And he did it brilliantly. I mean, you cannot take away from the fact that for the first time since FDR, the president has brought in additional senators and congressmen with him. He did do that. But you also have to remember that this plurality that by which George Bush won was the narrowest plurality of any incumbent president ever to be reelected. He only won by a little over 2.5 percentage points, whereas Bill Clinton won by 8, Ronald Reagan won by 18, Richard Nixon by 23%, and Harry Truman beat Tom Dewey by 5%. So this isn't, my only point here is not to take it away from the president, but to say this isn't a huge mandate, as I've heard it called. It doesn't say the country wants to be taken in a certain direction. We are very split as a nation.
And also, as you point out elsewhere in the book, this is wartime, and no president has been turned away in wartime.
Has ever been turned away in wartime.
After this short break, Christine Todd Whitman explains why the idea of a big tent party doesn't work.
If you've ever wondered where to find the captivating books we discuss on Now I've Heard Everything, wonder no more.
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
Plus, when you purchase through our affiliate links, you're not only diving into great stories, but also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2005 conversation with Christine Todd Whitman.
You're not taking away from the people with sincerely held beliefs. I mean, every American is entitled to vote his or her
Everyone
conscience.
is.
But I think what you're railing against is when their conscience when they try to force theirs on you and make you conform to everything that they believe in.
No, absolutely. I've always said there's room in my party for them. There's just no room in their party for me. And I was brought up with the vision of an umbrella party. We've heard a lot about the big tent during the Reagan years, but my father always said it was like an umbrella where you had a central handle that were those core sets of beliefs that united you as Republicans, and then you had all the ribs that supported the canopy, which were important to the overall umbrella, but without that central core they were nothing. And the ribs represent all the different ways of interpreting the central core philosophy. And there was room for, you needed them all. That's what made you strong, and I believe that was what will make our party strong. And if you truly believe in things like good fiscal policy, balanced budgets, if you believe in respect for the individual, and while there's a role for government, you try to problem solve closest to the individual first and then work your way up, not start at the federal government and work down. If you believe in engaged foreign policy, if you believe in a strong national defense and strong criminal justice system here, then those are the things that hold you together. And there are different interpretations on those, and they should be allowed within the Republican Party.
And it's interesting that all those things that you mentioned, as you talk about in the book, here we have an Austrian-born immigrant movie star who makes those same points, and people just go wild for it.
Yeah.
And he gets it. Arnold Schwarzenegger understands what you're talking about.
Oh, he does, absolutely. And I think the conservatives haven't gone after him because they don't need to. He can never be president. And I doubt that there will be a constitutional amendment to allow him to be president. Even if one were to pass, it would they'd probably grandfather him. So they don't have to worry about him. And interestingly enough, he could not have gotten the nomination to run for governor of California if he'd had to go through the normal process. He would not have made it in the party out there. But because of the circumstances, you had Gray Davis, the incumbent governor, resign early and everything, he was able to do it because he could mount that kind of outsider challenge, and it wasn't a standard primary situation. And so now he is in a position to do what he thinks is right, and it's great. And he is a moderate Republican, and he is that voice that I hope will get people to wake up as well and get onto the website, and through a whole host of different ways we can start to come together.
But I gather what you're also concerned about is not just the every 4 years presidential cycle, but obviously a president has power to appoint federal judges, Supreme Court justices.
Oh, yeah.
The effects of what you're talking about could be felt for generations to come.
Well, it absolutely can. And the other thing that I really worry about, it's not just about my party winning elections. I'm a Republican, sure, and because I believe in a certain philosophy of government, I'd like to see that in the position to actually control government, but it's also about the ability to govern. When you focus all your time and attention on hardening your base, that means you're going to be throwing red meat. You've got to be partisan to hold your partisan base. And that means you tend to go to those issues that are the ones that really excite passions. When you get the kind of campaigns we've had recently that get very personal, very nasty, loud shouting. A lot of people get turned off by it, but it also makes it very difficult for the people who get elected to come back together afterwards. And the partisanship here in Washington these days is as bitter and as deep as I've ever seen it, and it has prevented us from getting some important pieces of legislation even discussed, much less passed.
Such as environmental things.
Environmental legislation. I mean, the president, I've been fascinated to watch this whole discussion on the energy plan. Democrats and others have been very smart about focusing on who met with the vice president when. My response is, who cares? What you should care about is the plan. I mean, would it really made you feel made them feel any better if he'd sat down with the green groups every other week and then not paid any attention to them? No. What you care about is the plan. It doesn't matter who they met with. It's what are they now talking about? What do they want to implement? What's being sent to the Congress for discussion? Let's get the energy plan right. But we need an energy plan in this country, and we haven't even been able to get a discussion going.
But that great middle of America, the moderates, they'd love to see an environment. I don't think most people would care if it's the Republican plan, a Democratic plan. Just put a plan in place, get it going.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But we haven't been strong enough about that. And what we've been doing is allowing the candidates to get away with something that's totally natural if you're in a campaign situation. That the pollsters will tell you these are the issues that poll the best. So these are the issues to go after. Now, I don't know, I certainly know I wasn't particularly enlightened, and I don't know whether anyone else was, to have spent a full month and a half, if not 2 months, of the last presidential election cycle talking about what the two candidates had done 30 years before in their Vietnam service. I mean, there was enough in what they'd done recently to give you a good idea of what they might do as president or had done as president, and you wanted to know what will they do in the future. But the pollsters said these issues poll well for both sides. I mean, John Kerry wouldn't have brought up his record if he hadn't been told it was important to being commander-in-chief. And so they both went off on this tangent, and we let them. As the public, we absorbed all this, we got all into it, we got all excited about it, instead of saying, you know what, I don't care. I want to know what you're going to do in the environment. I want to know what you're going to do with Social Security. Tell me what we're going to do about the deficit. You know, really forcing those questions to be asked. And you can do it. We do have enormous power as individuals if we will recognize that means we have to get involved. And we have to be heard, whether it's calling into a radio station, writing letters to the editor, calling into some of the television talk shows. There's so many outlets now for people to be heard. And the candidates do listen, and the office holders do listen. They all have people in their staff that go through their letters every single day and their telephone logs and tell them who's calling in about what and where they are. And they'll respond. But we have a responsibility, too.
Would you like to be part of a moderate Republican administration at some point?
Oh, I'm not looking to come back to Washington. I left Washington to get home to New Jersey and spend some time with my husband, and I'm not looking for a way to get back here.
You're not done with politics, though, are you?
Oh, I'll stay involved in policy. I've started a new business, Whitman Strategy Group, and we do management consulting, strategic planning, and a lot of that will be in the kinds of issues that I've dealt with throughout my career as governor and in the EPA.
Christine Todd Whitman is 78 now. In 2022, she and former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang co-founded the centrist Forward Party. Now you can get your copy of It's My Party Too by Christine Todd Whitman by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also find my 2006 interview with John Kasich.
Sports, politics, business, religion, the pop culture, it's everywhere, this battle. One group of people who've decided I'd rather cash in, even if it costs me who I am, versus those people who say I'm not going to.
And my 2003 conversation with former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo.
One side attacks the other, you have to respond, you have to counter with a worse attack. It happens to be correct tactically in a campaign. I think it stops when the American people demand that it stops.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, as premiere week for our Season 7 continues, we'll revisit my 1991 conversation with the man often called a genius, the founding member of the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson.
The word genius is descriptive of a person. It's not the only word in the world to use to describe mental brilliance, but it does have a lot of bearing on myself and my music.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.